This is Surfing Through Cinema. I'm your host, Hawaii Harry. Today I'll be discussing the next film for Classic Hollywood Week. Starring Peter O'Toole and Sir Alec Guinness, this episode is all about David Lean's film, Lawrence of Arabia. Okay, so some technical details about Lawrence of Arabia. So David Lean based many of his shots off of the John Ford film The Searchers, especially the landscape shots in the desert. He based it a lot on the Mojave, I believe it was Mojave Desert, whatever desert it was in the U.S. He based the shots that John Ford captured in that movie and used it in this one. And another technical detail, much of the production was done on location. However, due to illness and throughout the production and due to budget constraints, they did have to move production to Spain for many of the locations, such as for Damascus and Egypt and all these other ones. But you wouldn't be able to tell. A lot of it looks really realistic to how Jerusalem did. So they did a really good job of disguising and hiding that. And then the last technical detail, this is the second longest Best Picture winner. The first one is still Gone with the Wind, and depending which version of Lawrence of Arabia you see, Gone with the Wind's either 1 minute longer or 10 minutes longer. And the Academy recognizes the theatrical cut of this movie, so about 10 minutes. But yeah, those are some technical details about Lawrence of Arabia. It took close to 10 years to put this movie together. And so many of the actors that were asked to be Lawrence, they turned it down because of that. They couldn't promise a decade of their life to this movie. And so Peter O'Toole, who plays Lawrence, or T.E. Lawrence, I should say, he was a relatively unknown actor, so him signing up for it was to put him in the limelight. Alright, so now let's get to the plot of Lawrence of Arabia. The way it's formatted, it has two parts with an intermission in between it. So I'll be discussing part one first. So the film begins in 1935 with Lawrence dying in a motorcycle accident, which is pretty ironic considering all the events we're going to see in this movie that you think, wow, he died from a motorcycle accident? But that's how it actually happened. And so at his funeral, there's a reporter. He's trying to get insights into Lawrence's life. He's asking many military leaders, many of his friends, to see how he was like, but none of them give the reporter a straight answer. And it kind of makes you think of how Citizen Kane is set up a little bit, where a reporter is going around asking details about Lawrence. And they never really go back to this, though. They just show this reporter at the beginning of the movie. They never go back to the results of it. So then it flashes back to World War I, where Lawrence, he's kind of a little rebel of a soldier. He's not really known as being a tough guy. He's, he studies on history. He's very well educated. So they kind of make fun of him for that. And he's asked by his higher officials to see how the Arab revolt against the Turks will play out. He has to meet with Prince Faisal, played by Sir Alec Guinness, to kind of discuss, how they're going to carry out this revolt. And this, like I said, it's the middle of World War I, and the Turks and the Arabs were fighting hardcore over Damascus and Syria, all the various areas within the Middle East. And against orders from his superior officer, Lawrence gains the favor of Prince Faisal, and Lawrence is able to devise and carry out a plan to attack Aqaba, which is a strategic location for the British to use for dropping off and carrying supplies. It's in a canal of sorts. And so with 50 men, one of them being Sharif Ali, who Lawrence has had a pretty tough relationship with, Sharif killed Lawrence's guide to this camp. So they butt heads a lot. They don't agree with each other. Sharif is more tough and more military-minded, whereas Lawrence is more free-thinking. And so they decide to cross through the Nefu Desert, which they have to travel day and night to get through it because it's super long and vast, and many people who go into it die. Like, it's not known as a thing people do, but he decides to do it anyways because it would cut through and get him closer to Agrabah than going around the normal route people take. And Lawrence proves his worth by turning back to rescue a fatigued man, one of the 50 men he fell off his camel in the middle of the night. So Lawrence decides to turn back to go get him, knowing full well that once the sun comes out, they'll potentially die of just of it being super hot and having no water or any supplies. But he does it anyways. And he brings the guy back, and Lawrence is seen as a very respected man now. So they give him some white robes so that now he's officially an Arab amongst them. And they're successful in overtaking Agrabah, and Lawrence, he goes to Cairo to inform his superior officers about the events that had transpired. And slowly but surely, we see Lawrence is kind of leaning more towards the Arab side than he is the British side. And, he refuses to put on a British uniform. He kind of acts a little like an Arab now. He's very different than when he started out on this journey. And, and so that's the end of part 1. And this part is where all those various shots you see from this movie, particularly the one with Sharif coming in on a camel, the most famous shot in the movie, this happens all in part 1. And they used a special lens to capture that, which I believe was 450 or 480 millimeters. And it's now known as the David Lean lens from from Panavision. And it was only used for that one shot. And the point of it was to keep Sharif in focus, even though he's a quarter of a mile away, running towards the camera, and gave that oasis effect. It was really, really cool. So that's the end of part 1. There's an intermission. And then part 2 starts off with Lawrence. He's kind of fully become an Arab now. He leads his men to overtake trains and supplies from the Turks. They blow up the tracks, they raid the train, kill all the men on it, etc. And there's a reporter who meets Lawrence there, and he kind of, interviews him, takes pictures of him. It makes Lawrence famous. He's a newspaper worker for the Chicago Tribune, one of the major newspapers in Chicago. And Lawrence has become world renowned for being this hero of the war. But this builds up Lawrence's pride, so he decides to go to the city of Daraa, which is overtaken by the Turks, to kind of prove that he's still invincible and doesn't need all of his men. And I'm going to have to turn it over. It's a pretty long plot. But he's captured and he's beaten almost to death because they find he's a white British man. So they decide to bludgeon him. They rip off his shirt and whip him and all kinds of stuff. And he's completely shaken from this, realizing he's mortal. He's not this god that he kind of thinks himself as. But he goes back to British lines and decides, you know what, I'm done with this. I don't want to do it anymore. But his superior officer, he convinces him to go back and invade Damascus for him. And Lawrence decides to rally up some more Arab soldiers. He hires men that are more interested in money than the actual cause. And he also gets Sharif and all those guys back. And they go on the road to Damascus. On their way, Lawrence and his new army, they encounter a battalion of Turks who had overthrown and destroyed a little village. So one of Lawrence's men was from this village that the Turks massacred. And so he decides to ride out on his own with a sword and says, "No prisoners!" And he goes and he's shot to death. He's unable to make it within 10 feet of them. And so then Lawrence, or he decides they need to go and attack and kill all these Turks. So he falls through, same battle cry, no prisoners, pulls out his sword. They all attack and kill every single one of those Turk soldiers. And Lawrence is covered in the other men's blood, and He's stabbing a bunch of people, shooting a bunch of people. He's become a total monster. And, but Lawrence, he regrets doing this close to the end of it. And there's a shot of him holding his knife, very similar to the one earlier in the movie when he first gets his uniform. And the first time he's doing it, he's like checking himself out, seeing how cool his robes look. But this time he's looking at it and realizing what a horrible man he's become, and he throws his knife away. So then his men, they make it to Damascus, they take it over, and now there's a council of different Arab tribes trying to unite and come to terms of reason to unite the culture. But this proves to be very difficult, and none of them can agree with each other, so they all just leave, and the British come and they take over Damascus, much to the reluctance and dismay of Lawrence. He really wanted Arabia to be free and not have to deal with British rule, but nonetheless they let it happen. So Lawrence, he's sent back to Britain. Prince Faisal and his general, they're both kind of sick of him now. They kick him out and send him back to Britain. And on his way back in a car, he sees a motorcycle passing him by, kind of leaving him in the dust, kind of foreshadowing his eventual demise because of this next adventure he picks out. Alright, and so that's where the film ends. It ends on that high note, kind of where it began with a motorcycle and Lawrence checking it out. Alright, so that's the plot to Lawrence of Arabia. I'm going to go on a break real quick, but first here's a message from our sponsor. This podcast is brought to you by Anchor. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Here's how. It's totally free. There are tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast from your computer and even your cell phone. But that's not all. Anchor distributes your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many, many more. You could even make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Anchor is everything you need to make a complete podcast all in one small place. So go on and download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started today. Okay, so now that we're back from our break, I'm going to get into some critical views and my personal views on Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence of Arabia won 7 Academy Awards at the 35th, and he was nominated for 10. Of those 7 that they won Best Picture and Best Director. It was widely popular worldwide when it came out. Steven Spielberg and Martin Scorsese contribute this as the movie that inspired them to get into movies. So it had a huge impact on culture, on the people, all kinds. And because of this, it has a 97% on Rotten Tomatoes, with general consensus of it being one of the best movies ever made. And it has an 8.3 out of 10 on IMDb. So critics and audiences, they agree that this is a pretty good movie. Many fans love the scenery in the desert. They love the musical score. And this is one of the most viewed and talked about movies. And so critics rave and love this movie. Now, we'll get into my personal views. I actually did not like it the first time I watched it. I thought it was really slow, a really slow story. It was really confusing. I didn't know a whole lot about World War I history, especially in that area. So it was kind of hard to follow, kind of hard to watch. But since that first time, I've done my research on it. I've studied more into T.E. Lawrence himself, learned more about this era and about what happened. And when I watched it this time around for the review, I actually appreciated it a whole lot more. So much so, it's actually in my top 5 movies of all time. And I have right here the version of the movie that I watched the first time, which I actually think attributes to why I didn't like it as much. Because, especially the first tape, it has aged horribly. There's a horrible rainbow effect on it. And when I watched it on my TV, because it was a VHS, they condensed it into the letterbox format, which would look fine on a standard definition TV, but I don't have standard definition, I have a high definition. So it was kind of hard to watch, and probably attributed to my disliking of it the first time. But this is evidence right here. You need to watch things probably 2 or 3 times to actually understand what's going on. And I'm really glad I gave it a second chance because I actually really like it now. I love the cinematography, especially in the overtaking of Agrabah. Seeing it pans from left to right, seeing all these horses and camels riding into the town, overtaking it, killing people, all of that. It's fantastic. I have no idea how they were able to choreograph all of that. It seems so intricate and so realistic that it's almost documentary style. But it was really, really cool, and I'm glad I gave it a second chance. And this time around, I watched it on iTunes. I rented it, so definitely not the letterbox format. It's a lot better on a bigger screen, a lot better in its correct format. So if you want to watch this movie, I recommend watching it on a big screen. This is definitely one of those that you need to see it in high definition. And now I do have some gripes with it still, even though I really like it. I think the overture in the very beginning, and that may be just in this newly restored director's cut, I felt it was so long. When it first started, I thought something was wrong. But no, it's just a really long overture. And I imagine it's because when it came out in theaters, there was people trickling in. I don't think they had too many ads or anything. So that would make sense why they had a long overture like that, giving people time to sit down and experience all the different songs. But it doesn't translate well to home media. And another thing I didn't like as much too, I think the first half has a lot better visuals and all of that, but I think the second half is a more compelling story and a lot more interesting. The first half it's nice to see it all setting up and the really wide shots. Like I said, the one with with Sharif coming in on the camel, classic shot. But I think the second half kind of shows more of a realistic point of view of Lawrence. So the first half, it sees him as this almost godlike figure rising to power, and then the second half showing it go the opposite direction. But other than that, like I said, it's in my top 5 favorite movies now. I really love the cinematography of it, especially Peter O'Toole. He's a really good actor. Very interesting seeing him kind of transition as an actor, as a character. I highly, highly recommend this movie. But yeah, you need to watch it in a higher quality, higher format than I did the first time. You want to have a good first impression of it. It is a long movie. It's almost 4 hours long. So I say watch it part 1 first and then part 2. That's kind of how I did it. I watched the first part first night, the second part the next night. That way I kind of divided it up. Alright, but those are my thoughts and feelings about Lawrence of Arabia. Next time, I'll be discussing the next film for Star Wars Week. This is one of those films that has divided fans so much. I don't think the fan base will ever recover from it, honestly. Directed by Rian Johnson of Breaking Bad acclaim, this episode is all about Star Wars Episode 8, The Last Jedi. Alright, well until next time, this has been Surfing Through Cinema with Hawaii Harry. Take care. Thank you for listening to Surfing Through Cinema. Make sure to check us out on Facebook at Surfing Through Cinema with Hawaii Harry and on Instagram with Surfing Through Cinema. We also have a website, www.anchor.fm/Surfing Through Cinema, where you can learn more details on upcoming episodes and on past episodes.